Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott. I'm your host and a member of the Latin American Perspectives editorial collective. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Jonathan Ritter about his new issue of LAP, Music, Politics, and Social Movements in Latin America. Jonathan Ritter is an associate professor of ethnomusicology and the chair of the Department of Music at the University of California Riverside, and a coordinating editor of Latin American Perspectives. For today's show, we'll be analyzing the role of music in contemporary social movements in Latin America, while also including some clips from contemporary and classic songs that have featured in social movements across the continent. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. Jonathan, welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about it.
So just to start, this is a question I ask all of our guests. Would you just please describe the main theme of the issue and how the issue came about?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's titled Music, Politics, and Social Movements in Latin America. We're in the 50th year of LAP, and it's a journal that's done so many extraordinary things. I joined the editorial collective 12 or 13 years ago now. It's been quite a while, so certainly not the entire 50-year span, but I've always admired the coverage that exists in the journal, thinking through contemporary issues, historical issues, looking at the left. But the emphasis has definitely, with LAP, been sort of history, political science, sociology, social sciences in general. But there have been little moments throughout that history where the arts come in, cultural coverage in different ways. A couple of really great things on Latin American culture a few years ago. But there's not been a lot on music in that. So when I joined the collective, Ron and I and others, started talking about the possibility of this, that maybe this was a moment, given that I'm a musician, an ethnomusicologist, so this is what I work on. So the impetus behind this was really the realization that there's something that hasn't been talked about maybe enough yet in LAP. And I was just kind of waiting for the right moment for that to happen. And for better and for worse, that moment was right before the pandemic. So that both kind of slowed things down. But in other ways, it was really fortuitous because a lot's been happening musically and politically in Latin America in the last few years. And that, I think, ultimately is reflected in the kind of articles that we got. So in terms of themes, beyond that, just broad kind of looking at how music, politics, and social movements intersect in a Latin American context. One of the fun things and the challenges of a special issue is you don't know it's not an edited volume where you start off and say, these are the exact things that we're going to cover that have to be there. You put out a call for papers and you encourage people to, send things in and then you see what you get at the end of it. So this special issue for me it's a really nice kind of melding of the things that I really wanted to see authors talk about, really diving in deep into what's happening musically with particular political moments or social movements happening right now or historically. But there also were things that I didn't really think about, or they weren't on my mind when we pitched this with the call for papers that came in. There are a lot of articles that talk about intergenerational kind of the links between social movements and political moments in the past and the way they're brought forward into the future. And even as someone that's been working in this field for 25 years, thinking about the way that music endures in particular kinds of ways, that the political moment in 1972 is not where we are in 2023. But a piece of music written in 1972 that has remained popular, with deeply meaningful to activists in certain political contexts, whatever, today can help inspire, inform, etc. So there's some interesting things happening there. And then lots of coverage of particular genres that are sort of famously political. So there's a lot in this issue.
There is a lot. I'm really excited about it. All the folks from LAP who I've talked to are really excited about it. Now, we all know, all people interested in politics, we all know that music is really significant to social movements. But just to ask like a general question, I want to hear your take on this. What exactly does music do in political and social movements? and in moments of social change and revolution. And why is it so significant to both progressive and revolutionary movements, as well as counter-revolutionary or reactionary forces?
That's the $1 million question.
Right.
That's the big one. Like, what's, why talk about music at all when people are talking about poverty? They're talking about we need to change the entire, social contract here, how we are governed. What does music have to do with that? And I wish I could give you a pithy, one sentence answer, but in some ways, this entire issue is an exploration of that. The biggest thing I would say, and this comes out of where I am as a scholar, what interests me, what motivates my own work, and to be honest, what motivates probably 75-80% of the scholars who work on the kinds of things that I do, not just in Latin America, but all over the world, on this question. Why is music always in the middle of all of this? Right. And from wildly different political perspectives, organizing kind of impeti, etc. I would say the first thing that we have to do is get away from the idea that music reflects a political moment. And what I mean by that is there's often people turn to, especially writers, journalists, and a lot of scholars, here's an important political moment. Here's a song lyric that illustrates, that thing. So that music is over here in its own category, and culture and politics or whatever's happening, the important stuff is over here. And there's just this sort of mirror effect that music reflects what's happening there. And I think what scholarship on music, culture, the arts over and over and over again has shown is it's integrated. It's in the middle of the struggle. It's an important part of the struggle, however that struggle is being defined. And so my dissertation, my work for 20 plus years now, most of it has been in Peru and kind of mapping the history of what happened musically in the country and politically in the country through its music during the Shining Path guerrilla insurrection, what's now called the armed internal conflict in the 1980s and 90s, and the continuing legacies of that today. And when I first started my research, which was mostly ethnographic and working with communities on the ground in southern Peru, particularly in Ayacucho, where the Shining Path kind of formed and came from.
Yeah, the zone.
The zone,
heartland,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, I went there really with this very open-ended question of what happens musically in a place that just completely melts down, has this terrible, terrible conflict, all this violence, so many people die, so many people have to flee. And Ayacucho was famous as a place of folk music and this rich ritual tradition in Andean areas. To some extent, my question was just what happens in a place like that where there's this thriving thing and then suddenly there's all this violence. And what I found on every side of that very complicated time and conflict is the Shining Path used music more than anyone. I mean, it was the principal thing they were doing. The first few years they were organizing in the countryside was getting people together in mandatory schools, and then they all had to sing together for an hour. Revolutionary songs, folk songs with new Maoist lyrics, etc. And as the violence spun out of control, people on the ground, what was the only voice? And I heard this over and over again. The only voice that they had, the place they could express what was going on, whether they opposed the Shining Path, opposed the government, were just terrified about so many people in their own communities being killed, were complaining about the rising costs of everything because of inflation. All of that stuff was happening in all of this music there. Nobody else outside of those communities ever heard it. It was happening internally, and at that point, you couldn't post it on YouTube, etc. But it brought back and really reinforced for me this realization that music, again, wasn't some sort of separate category reflecting what was going on. It was actually how political organizing was going on. It was how people were responding. It was the place that you could make a political statement precisely because of the special nature of musical performance and the kinds of public space that it opens, social space that it opens. So, what does music do? In some ways, it does all the things that social movements do because it's happening right there. And yet we have, and then this is the other part I think is important to recognize. In some of the articles that we have in the special issue, is everybody recognizes that on some level. So including reactionary forces, including the state. So I liked how you phrased this question on, why is it so important, or what does it do on all sides? One of the articles, and here's Stephen Boxay's article on the history of censorship of samba in Brazil, looks precisely at the military government in Brazil in the late 20th century, and the ways, even extending beyond the years of the dictatorship, the ways that the government stepped in really explicitly to censor songs that they knew would have an emotional impact, a potential organizing impact. And especially there, you've got both a sort of the political dimension of opposition to the military regime, but also Afro-Brazilian organizing and rethinking racial categories and what that means in a place like that. So all of those are wrapped up together in this censorious regime. And on the flip side, you've got an article like Daniel Party's looking at how even today, in 2019, 2020, conservative forces within Chile during the middle of the whole 2019, 2020 uprisings, we're creating counter anthems to condemn the violence of these street mobs that are out there. And of course, not talking about the violence of the carabineros and not talking about the violence the state was inflicting on protesters, but rather they burned some things in the streets and they threw something through a window and it's terrible. So trying to write music that would capture the energy of this huge musical thing that was happening and direct it in a different way. And as Daniel Party makes clear, they weren't very successful with it, but it's a kind of an interesting example of everyone recognizing there is something really powerful in what music's doing in those moments.
Wow. That's really interesting, though, thinking about, because I studied the far right, so, this past years, especially in the United States, we've had these, right-wing anthems come out, Don't Try That in a Small Town, or that one with the ginger-looking guy singing that song, Rich Men from Richmond, and right-wing music kind of just sucks. It doesn't appeal to me, but but it's definitely a vehicle. Yeah.
Well, I do think it's worth noting that there are those specific examples, and actually, if you dig back here in the United States, we all talk about the 1960s and the folk music revival and Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and that scene, that was anti-war and pro-civil rights. And that absolutely was this huge thing. At that time, there also was a counter-organizing musical movement that was both using popular music or defining folk music in this very clean-cut kind of way that didn't have those terrible leftist Marxist political associations, right? But also, Ballad of the Green Berets. There was constantly this attempt in this country, and it continues through sort of white supremacist death metal, etc. It's in all of these different genres. For better and for worse, scholars tend to write about things that they sympathize with, that they like. And so we have endless coverage of one end of the political spectrum on this, and not very many people who study or want to or talk about something that actually was really culturally significant and continues to be. Those two songs you just mentioned are really great examples of it.
That's fascinating. I'll have to pick your brain about that after the interview more. So getting back to the issue at hand, though, I think that it's typical to associate political or social movements with the term protest music. You highlight this in the introduction, or also the term militant songs. But you argue that the almost singular focus on protest or militant songs and their textual analysis in the protest song research paradigm, it's kind of obscured the many other ways that music may play a role in social movement organizing. Can you please expand on this point?
Yeah. This is, in some ways, it's a little bit of a disciplinary obsession from where I'm coming from as a music scholar. There's a really easy tendency to just pluck a song lyric out and say, here's the political work that something does. Maybe the most famous example in U.S. politics of a kind of hilarious misunderstanding was Ronald Reagan using Born in the USA, Bruce Springsteen's song.
Right.
Because you take Born in the USA, like just that part of the song, and sure, it sounds like some big patriotic anthem. And of course, the rest of the song is like the terrible life of a Vietnam vet. Yeah. And like, it's ironic, it's sarcastic, but that precisely not paying attention to the entire song context, not paying attention to the music, to the whole package, but rather just plucking one lyric out can lead to this, very big misunderstanding of what a piece of music does. So that's one piece of this, I think. And it's actually two sociologists who write a great book called Playing for Change, that's looking at the history of music and social movements, mostly in the United States, but with a little bit of global coverage. And they talk about this, the L equals ARM fallacy, the lyrics equals audience received message fallacy. And so if all you're doing is plucking out, even if that was the composers, even if Bruce Springsteen had been an ardent, rah USA nationalist or something in 1984, that doesn't mean that's what every audience that hears that song is going to get from it. So how do we start to understand? And maybe the perfect example is Chile in 2019-2020. El derecho de vivir en paz, the right to live in peace, becomes the anthem of that movement. It's being sung by everybody, literally by 1 million people in the streets of Santiago. El derecho de vivir, poeta Ho Chi Minh, que golpea de Vietnam a toda la humanidad, ningún cañón borrará el surco de tu arrozal, el derecho de vivir en paz. It's a 50-year-old song that was like, even at the time, kind of unusual folk rock anthem by Victor Jara, but unlike most of Victor Jara's music, where it's him and his amazing voice and just with a guitar and that kind of vibe of the singer-songwriter, he's working with a young rock band, Los Blops, in El Derecho de Vivir en Paz. So it's a unusual song even within Victor Jara's music, but the whole song is about the Vietnam War. It's a protest song against the Vietnam War and the glorious road of Ho Chi Minh. Now, in 2019, in Chile, as people are marching down the streets, protesting everything that they are protesting about 30 years of neoliberal governments, post-dictatorship, and everything that needs to change, there weren't a lot of Ho Chi Minh supporters that saying this is what we need. People weren't that worked up about the war in Vietnam 50 years before. But that little snippet of lyric, El Derecho de Vivir en Paz, the fact that everybody knows that song, it's a Victor Jara song, and Victor Jara was martyred by the Pinochet government, and that song has a 50-year trajectory of being associated with the people's struggle in Chile. All of those associations are part of what made it really powerful in 2019, 2020. But if you just look at the lyrics, you might have to come to the conclusion that, everyone's a Vietnamese communist in Chile in 2019. So that's sort of a perfect example of why we need to get away from just thinking that protest music is the thing that does everything. I also think we have to, as a musician and as a music scholar, get beyond just the lyrics and look at the music, because no matter what's going on in the lyrics, whether they are dead on to the moment or something like that, Derecho de Vivir en Paz, there's something else going on there. Music itself conveys messages. It sets up a framework for understanding and listening to something. It connects people with a particular. So another well-known book in this sort of subfield by a couple of European scholars called Music and Social Movements. They talk about about mobilizing traditions within a social movement context, and where you pull on the cultural traditions of whatever the group of people it is you're trying to organize to amplify what's happening there, but also to help people ground what they're doing within something that, even if you're pushing for a new world, you ground it in your community, in your context. And the most famous example of this is the civil rights movement, where it comes out of the Black church. You sing songs that come out of the Black church, and it not only had a really important collectivist spirit and people performing together and all those things that happen, performing together, singing together, etc. But I mean, the fact that it was coming out of a century, 2 centuries, multiple centuries of struggle and the cultural traditions that already had been a voice of resistance and working through, racism in the history of African Americans in this country. So had it been, people with guitars just singing folk music or something, well, at that time there were people doing that, but it was the music of the Black church within that created this, still to this day in American history, people know, We Shall Overcome, etc., those songs as coming out of that particular experience. And it was that melding of, again, sort of bringing forward cultural traditions and things that made sense, and then using them as the stepping stone towards the struggle.
In the introduction, you point to Thomas Torino's useful distinction between what he calls presentational music and participatory music. Would you describe this distinction for our listeners and why you think it's so significant?
Sure. Yeah. So Tom Torino is an ethnomusicologist, anthropologist. He's done some great, tremendous ethnographic work in Latin America, particularly in the Andes, which is how I first got to know his work. But he went actually on after that to work in Zimbabwe. A foundational scholar at this point in my field for his work on nationalism, popular music, cosmopolitanism. But through all of it, he's also been interested in semiotics, Persian semiotics, and I won't drag all of Persian semiotics into a podcast conversation.
We got time, but
But what Torino does so brilliantly with that is, I think he doesn't come from a place of let's find lots of complicated categories for things and take a linguistic approach to taking all these things apart, but rather starts with the questions on what does music do in a political moment? What's actually happening here? And in 2008, he published a book called Music as Social Life that remains for me one of the most important books published in my field in 20 or 30 years, because he's asking those kinds of questions and then using the tools of semiotics and anthropology and ritual studies and things to try to unpack and answer those. And one distinction that he makes there, coming from this kind of semiotic approach, but also an experiential approach of thinking, rather than thinking about songs and music as objects, as, well, here's this song and it's on a shelf somewhere or floating in the air in our computers in the hard drive or something, but all these things are experiences that happen in time. You and I listen to a song together. That's an experience. It's not just some song that's out there. And the ways and contexts in which we do that impact, how we experience them and then what we take from that experience. So he draws this distinction between participatory and presentational kinds of music, which in hindsight seems like it took until 2008 for somebody to make this very simple observation, but many kinds of music that you and I probably listen to generally are presentational forms of music. They are performed by, written by, professional musicians in this country, or even if it's not a professional context, there's someone who is the performer, and we're the audience. They present what it is, whether it's through a recording or we go to a concert and listen to it. They're the ones on the stage. We are sitting over here, and that allows certain things to happen, right? A Bob Dylan, a Mercedes Sosa, whoever can be on stage, sing something really powerful, unpack a long and complicated idea through a new piece of music. I just heard Nano Stern in concerts last week. Great young Chilean singer-songwriter, both on tour for a new album that he did of covers of Victor Jara songs from, it's the 50th anniversary of the coup and of Victor Jara's death. So this really powerful performance of that, but also his new songs talking about, his place as an artist and what's happening in Chile today. So really powerful, beautiful, but his voice. But during that concert, he also consistently was trying to get the audience involved to sing along, to break down that barrier. And so this is the other side that Torino's getting at. In that case, we still have a professional performer, but there are a lot of cases, especially in social movement organizing, where it's everybody on the street together. I live in Burbank in the middle of the Hollywood studios. Everybody's been on strike for 6 months. I drive out of town every morning and the picket lines are up. People are out singing, they are dancing, music is always playing. It is not a quiet thing, and it's not everyone giving a political manifesto. There's music going on all the time. And rarely is that like a concert or that there's some professional singer or something. It's everybody being engaged in it. There not being that kind of division. And that creates something special. It creates something political or proto-political, to be sure. Another scholar, political scientist, Mark Mattern, wrote a book called Acting in Concert. And he looks precisely at these kinds of collective moments of, in his case, he was looking at music in different communities and the ways that that experience of singing together, dancing together, moving together, being on a picket line together, all of those things create a kind of collective spirit that can keep a movement going, that can, what are the challenges of social movements? Getting people involved, convincing them of the cause, keeping them motivated to keep showing up, teaching them new parts of the struggle. Music plays a role, and in fact can do a kind of extraordinary job, if you will, within those goals for certain things like that. So participatory music, and again, if we just look at the lyrics might not, you can sing a Britney Spears pop song that doesn't have a shred of political intent in the way that we usually talk about political intent. But if it's got everybody there moving together, dancing together, having a good time together, wanting to show up on the picket line every day for the next month, now you have something political going on, right? No matter what the song was about, which again sort of brings us back to that, just focusing on the lyrics. And let me give you an example from this issue. There are a couple of articles that do really interesting work looking at, one of them by a couple of great Brazilian scholars, Simon Pereira and Rosil Gerert, looking at electronic music dance parties in Sao Paulo, which doesn't sound like a super political thing to begin with. And on
my experience with that type of music is
right. So electronic dance parties, and the moment they're talking about is this movement out of private clubs, sort of exclusive, expensive, more private clubs, and into these larger street festivals and street parties. But if you want to do that, you've got to get permission. You have to start doing some organizing to figure out how you're going to make that happen. And then that leads people to start thinking about, okay, civically, what are the other things that we need to organize around? And we've got this organization, and it leads to a new way of thinking for a group of people that, literally what it began with was the fight for the right to party. And suddenly you've got social movement organizing going on. And then you've got a repressive government coming in the mid-2010s in Brazil, both at the municipal and the federal level, that are clamping down on any kind of public, open expression, etc., like that. So again, if you're just looking at the lyrics, this is not music that's making some political kind of statement, but it's doing something really interesting and important politically. And there are several examples like that. Another great article on queer dance clubs and queer dance music in Chile. That again, a lot of it, some of the artists are people who are really politically active around LGBTQ rights, but a lot of the political effect of what they were doing was standing up and representing what it was to be queer and part of the pop music firmament there. So not only LGBTQ fans or club goers, but much wider audiences sort of looking at them, the messages that they were sending, and creating safe spaces for queer people in Chile shifts something politically that, again, may not be because they were writing anthems about LGBTQ rights, but rather, hey, let's all get together and dance and party in ways that are safe and recognize the humanity of LGBTQ people. So, again, if we just reduce it to presentational kinds of music, as Torino's talking about, of something being sung from a stage, we've missed so much of what's actually happening.
Media and smartphones have fundamentally changed how social movements are waged and mobilized. What have been the implications for musical activism and politics?
Yeah, I just read a couple of months ago Zeynep Tufekci's book on networked protest, and I don't know if you know her or know that work, a Turkish journalist. I think she's Turkish, but writes for the New York Times, but is also an academic. And she wrote, I think, one of the first books really looking at social media, hashtag activism, etc. And particularly, she was looking at the Arab Spring
Right.
as the moment that, occupying this country, Arab Spring, all that happens.
The
right?
Facebook revolution.
Exactly.
Right,
Right at kind of the moment that everybody suddenly has a phone in their hand and they're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, etc. The subtitle of her book is like Twitter, tear gas, and something.
Yeah.
And so all that, of course, as we know, is happening in Latin America as well. The Yo Soy 132 in Mexico, like all of those movements are happening simultaneously, 2010, 11, 12. And then there's music within all of that. And as I see it, and it comes out, it was very striking to me, every article in this special issue that's looking at music and a social movement in the last decade talks about social media. Every single one of them, whether they, in the article are highlighting that as something that we need to think critically about in a different kind of way, or just matter of fact, like, this is the world we live in, this is part of how it happens. I think music, there's a couple of different ways that music is playing a part in this, or social media is playing a part in what music does in social movements. On the one side, the same thing that's happening with social movements in general, musicians are organizing on social media. The very first article in here is about the Jaraneros, the Son Jarocho players in Mexico City, organizing around Ayotzinapa in 2015, all of the huge protest marches against the disappearance of
the 43 students. Yeah.
Yep, the 43 students. And, Son Jarocho is a music that's been in every protest movement in Mexico and student movement for 50 years at this point. Fascinating history of its own. But social media-wise, hashtags, like organizing on social media, this is where we're meeting at this corner, bring your jarana, etc. So social media is being used to organize musicians for protests and for things, to compose and write things like, hey, I've got a lyric, like, let's spread all of this so when we get to the protest, we're already ready to go. But I think with music, it's also doing something maybe more interesting, or something that we need to think more about, which is dissemination. And this is what, beyond social movement organizing or anything, has changed completely in the last 20 years, is we went from dissemination of music and recorded products had to be a physical material product, whether it was an LP or a cassette or a CD, all of that history. And then in the 21st century, we suddenly have digital downloading and MP3s and now streaming, and it has completely changed the nature of how music spreads in ways that, this is the conversation we're all living with all the time. On the one hand, I can sit down and write a protest song against what's happening in the U.S. House of Representatives today, and I can go post it on YouTube this afternoon. There is an ability to put a sort of small d democratizing nature of social media and that kind of dissemination that's thrilling and super exciting. You know, the means of production, if you want to put it in those terms, are now in the hands of everyone with very inexpensive equipment. You can record, you can disseminate, you can be a one-person show. But there are a billion people doing that every day. So how do you get your music heard? How does yours break through now the din of a billion other people who have uploaded everything to YouTube? And that remains something very much controlled, the ebb and flow of it, by social media companies, by governments. You know, we're seeing in the world right now where the internet gets turned on and turned off, where it gets channeled into only this kind of social media or that kind of social media. So we're still, I think, in the trenches of figuring out that struggle and the impacts, because there's a feeling like things are going right. Like, this is amazing. This is great. I can put this stuff out there. But, and maybe I'll end this answer on a more hopeful note. Well, I'm not sure if it's hopeful. So the government in Peru fell apart last December. Months of protests and still ongoing questions of what's really going to pull the country out of that. You know, deep disgust with the state of political affairs by most people in Peru. In those protests, all kinds of music started disseminating through social media. You know, hashtag activism, gather at this place, we're going to do this kind of music. And I mean, Peru is such a rich country musically, so regional kinds of folk music are being used. New hip-hop anthems are being released and disseminated that way. All of that's going on, but an interesting sort of specific social media angle. So the government of Dina Boluarte, the army and police, I forget which armed force it was of the state, but opened fire on protesters in Juliaca in southern Peru in January, the beginning of this year. Killed at least a dozen people. I'm forgetting the exact details, but it was one of the big moments of you know, the people were dying in all kinds of these protests, but this was a big number, a big kind of attack. And brass band musicians, part of like the local sindicato there of brass band musicians, wrote kind of on the spot this song, Dina Asesina, Dina the Assassin, and perform it. And, you know, people are filming it in the streets, it gets uploaded, and suddenly in the rest of the country and all the other protests, people are hearing and seeing that song, and they adapt it to whatever kind of music and musicians, ensemble, whatever they have there. And suddenly this one song emerges as one of the kind of big anthems of those protests this year, in the early months of this year, but being performed in all of these different ways because everyone heard the one version of it, of the people who wrote it, and then adapted it to whatever kind of music spoke to their part of the country, whether it was a different kind of folk music ensemble or just people singing the lyrics. None of that would have happened, or it would have happened at a glacial pace, you know, over the course of months or years or something prior to social media. And now, one day to the next, you know, things can spread all over the place.
Asesina, el pueblo te repudia. infantil. Sueldos millonarios para los corruptos, sueldos millonarios para los corruptos, balas y fusiles para nuestro pueblo, balas y fusiles para nuestro pueblo. Esta democracia ya no es democracia, esta democracia ya no es democracia. Dina asesina, el pueblo te repudia, Dina asesina, el pueblo te repudia.
Now, you already touched upon this question, but maybe we can dive a little deeper. So, beyond music's positive utility for progressive and revolutionary movements, scholars, as you've pointed to, have long warned that the power and potential of music as a tool for political action isn't always or inherently positive or progressive. I'd like to hear more on this point, and if you have any thoughts on the potential political or social costs of the nonstop production and dissemination of new musical tech.
Yeah, great question. Maybe I think I'll answer it in three ways. One that we did touch on some already is the realization that music is not inherently progressive. It is a powerful tool that can be used for all kinds of different organizing. We talked a little about Tom Torino's work. One of the case studies in that book, in fact, a whole chapter, he looks at the participatory collective song performances for the civil rights movement as this famous example of that, and the way it drew on this particular tradition and the power people drew from singing together peacefully in the face of fire hoses, and that was such a powerful thing. But 10 years before, Nazis were singing in big collective voice choirs projecting German nationalism. And something very similar was going on in Nazi party organizing and that collectivist, very exclusionary version of collectivist spirit that happened in Germany at that point. So that's a striking contrast of the way that this might not always go the way that we think it's going to when people get together and sing. And so recognizing and thinking about how we study and understand what music does means recognizing that kind of power and the way it can be turned. And that actually would lead me to a second point, which is about co-optation. And there's such a long history, especially with commercial popular music, of the thing that begins as counter-hegemonic, the thing that is intending to break down the system, being sucked into the system, and popular music is filled with this. Rock and roll is the voice of protest and resistance until it's not. Punk is the music of protest and resistance until it's not. Salsa, you listen to Salsa Dura from the 1970s and Ruben Blades and all of these other amazing politically engaged. I mean, you could learn the entire history of Latin America just listening to Ruben Blades. And then you can, 10 years later, it's all salsa romantica. It's all, that progressive political edge to that sound, the New York barrio, etc. It gets bled out of the genre. So, as things get, this is how hegemony works, right?
Right.
It's the counter-hegemonic gets pulled into the hegemonic constantly. So finding ways within, I think, social movement contexts to utilize music and push back against that kind of co-optation is really necessary, and there are great examples of that here. Sambas are another really interesting one, that the history of samba in Brazil, but similar in that, in some ways, Afro-Brazilian, very grassroots kind of expression, becomes promoted by the state by the mid-20th century, is a huge commercial enterprise today, and yet there's constantly a pullback in the communities of sort of more grassroots forms of it, or even within the big, the Sambodromo and the super commercial, tourist-oriented kind of market stuff, these messages that slip in. It's like the thing that can't quite be contained by that, So I think that's another piece of this. And the third thing I would say is gets at some of what George Eutyche has written about cultural expediency. In spite of and in the context of everything that we've just been talking about for a while now, at the end of the day, when people need to eat, they don't need a song, they need food to eat. And the song, the musical struggle, the social movement struggle are about getting to those kinds of changes, material changes. But what sometimes happens, what often happens, and it's a different kind of co-optation, is that's the easy thing to do, is put on a song festival of singer-songwriters talking about poverty or whatever. Great. We're not actually going to try to change the structural conditions that are leading to poverty, that are leading to disenfranchisement, etc. Mm-hmm. But we'll put up a stage and, maybe put out a recording or a nice website or something. So trying to find a way to push back against that very neoliberal tendency to co-opt the political intent and possibility, the resistance, if you will, that is inherent in so many of these movements. I work a lot because of the work in political violence in Peru with songs about the Shining Path era, people pushing back against the kind of violence, physical violence inflicted upon them and their communities, the struggle for memory today. And there's a similar dynamic there sometimes around that human rights groups want to promote alternate forms of memory in ways that are progressive and really great and recognizing what's going on. But often they're coming into a community and they're like, I'd far rather get the road paved on the way into town than have another song contest where we'll write some more songs talking about the fact that the road is not paved. So finding ways to leverage the musical intent, etc., of that's leading to real structural change and not sort of driving it off into, this is in carnival studies, this is the steam valve kind of argument, right? Does carnival lead to change, or does it just get everybody to party for a few days and forget about it, and then it pulls the revolutionary energy and steam off for another year, and then we let it blow off for a little while again? So finding the balance between those.
The last question I have is, you suggest that the changing sounds, genres, and combination of online and physical spaces in which music accomplishes its political work today suggest a need for new ways of studying and understanding its motivation and effects. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think this question brings us back to the beginning. What does music do in these moments? How do we study it? How do we understand it? And in an activist sense, how do we promote music, promote the understanding of the role that it can play in ways that are leading to positive change, right? I think in doing that, to reiterate, I think we need to take music and the arts and culture seriously, not as ephemeral side distractions from the important thing. The road does need to be paved. I'm arguing that, but I think part of how we get the road paved is by looking at what brings people together. I decided not to make this issue about music and politics, in part because that's just so broad and so, a little bit useless as a category. But by putting the emphasis on social movement organizing, getting us to think about, okay, how political change happens, one of the ways, not the only way, but one really important way is people coming together, collectively organizing to push for concrete goals, whatever that goal is. And I think the articles that are in here, and certainly what I have believed and worked in my entire career, is that music and the arts have not just a side role, but an important role frequently in that kind of struggle. So as scholars, but as activists as well, taking that seriously, looking at what's working and what's not working. And maybe a piece of that, like I said, I learned some things editing this particular issue, and one of them, to bring that point back, is this notion of intergenerational struggle in the way one social movement leads to another, and the kind of linkages, the cultural traditions that are mobilized within it. It's not something I'd given maybe enough thought to, but over and over again in this collection, I keep seeing, there's a great article by a young Brazilian scholar on Brazilian rap. And, just kind of looking at contemporary, politically engaged rap, hip-hop artists in Brazil right now. but she centers their work, and part of what's coming through in theirs to their connection to prior generations of musical activists in Brazil, and the ways they're sampling their works, they're visually doing things with their videos that draw upon album covers from back in the Tropicalia days and MPB during the dictatorship. So understanding, and this is, again, I see this as something really hopeful and useful about music, that it's hard to recapture the energy and what people were thinking, what was the correct ideological line in 1968 in Brazil in such and such a party. We need to know that. We don't want to repeat mistakes, and we want to learn from whatever. But we can still listen to the music from 1968. And people are still listening to the music from 1968. Right. And when a hip-hop artist in 2023 is sampling whoever from 50 years before, they're making an argument about the importance of that thing before. They're making an argument about, I'm part of a tradition. They're reaching out to people who were a part of that moment previously and saying, this is still part of your struggle. I mean, that to me is such a rich and complex, it opens such rich and complex possibilities for how we then come together and organize for political change, whatever, on ecology. I mean, and that's the other thing that comes through over and over and over again. The kinds of things that we have social movements about and how we organize have changed and expanded. Environmental rights and ecological justice. Nobody was talking about that in 1965. It's a huge and necessary and important part of already existing struggles and new ways that in really urgent ways we need to think about today. Gender, queer rights. I mean, all of these kinds of things that were embryonic or non-existent 50 years ago are part of the struggle today, but they're not connected to what happened before. And music provides one of these ways of making that linkage, I think.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for meeting with me today. I'm really excited to read this and share with my students and colleagues. And I thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex.
Well, that is all the time that we have for today, but thank you so much for listening in. The new issue of LAP, Music, Politics, and Social Movements in Latin America, is available online through Sage Publishing. Check the show notes for a link to where you can access the issue and for information about the different musical artists we featured on today's show. To receive updates from our journal about new issues, articles, and podcasts, please be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your preferred podcast listening app. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.
Paskanya nyukai kukachanchik Chai leyes niki kuna hambra ikuya Chai mantatah ninki Yahtan chigrai kuyam kanki Amasi chiwai chunyukai kuya chani kunya Chai luyas kaiki kuna Manam nyau saya chiwa sunchu Kaita kikuna tawantin suyumanta Nyau pajaturuna kuna pakal pangwang Yapanchi reskari muchkanchi Kaita willaspa Kaita rimaspa Con el son yahta mata yahta paz Solo con guaraca y megáfono para la plaza Contra tu jangra sistema que no pasará Porque esto es resistencia cultural Yahta masilla y hatariku sunchi Bagman purispa purisunchi Yahta masilla y hatariku sunchi Tuku yahta kuna kaipikanchi Yahta masilla y hatariku sunchi Bagman purispa purisunchi Yahta masilla y hatariku sunchi Tuku yahta kuna kaipikanchi Cae mi hip hop en resistencia Informados en la plaza un pueblo que se levanta Ante tanta represión por una constitución del 93 ¿Acaso ya no ves que nos quieren callados difundiendo supuesta democracia? Solo pura falacia Decidiendo por la comunidad sin consulta popular Leyes asesinas que fabrican y una breve basura para justificar las vidas de mis hermanos que ya no están A causa de las balas ordenadas por un gobierno de corrupción y desgracia. La sangre derramada del pueblo no se olvida porque esto es memoria combativa. La sangre derramada del pueblo no se olvida porque esto es memoria combativa. 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 Yahta masiyay hatariku sunchi. Bahma purispa purisunchi. Yahta masiyay hatariku sunchi. Tuku yahta kuna kaipika.